Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm going to tell you today about South African prisoners of war, South African POWs in World War II. And there were a total of 16,430 prisoners of war from South Africa during World War II. And they were largely captured during the North Africa campaign. And they were prisoners of war in Italian prisoner of war camps. Most of them were. And they faced many horrible conditions. First of all, there were limited doctors, limited medical supplies, limited medical treatment, and a lot of times, even though they requested medical treatment, the Italian prison guards, I should say, the Italian prison guards said there were doctors there who were going to get you medical treatment, but they, by and large, were lies. And the latrines were not well managed, and a lot of times the South African prisoners of war were only prohibited to use latrine during the daytime. They were prohibited to go out during nighttime to use a latrine. And a lot of times there were just tin cans to go into the restroom in. And dysentery was rife in those POW camps. Okay? And the South African POWs were not compensated very well after the war, mainly because the war ended in 1945, and in 1948, the National Party took control, and they had a lot of pro-Hitler and pro-Nazi sentiment in them at the time. They did. And the National Party did not compensate the POWs very well, nor the South African World War II veterans, even though they should have been. And they were tortured a lot by Italian guards, and they were beaten. I mean, it was just horrible prisoner of war conditions, horrible conditions for the prisoners of war during their time as prisoners of war. And Karen Horne wrote a good book, South African POWs in World War II, and she touches on a lot of those issues, and that was published by Stellenbosch University. And I highly recommend that book. I have read that book. And it goes into further detail of the stuff the prisoners of war faced. And it talks about extensively about the prisoner of war lives of Fred von Alfenstahl, Fred Geldenhuys. There were several Afrikaner prisoners of war, as well as South Africans of English descent who were prisoners of war. And again, I highly recommend that book. It does talk about how the majority of South Africans, the majority of white South Africans, supported the British and Winston Churchill, but there was a lot of pro-Nazi sentiment amongst South Africans at the time, because they did come across, in a prisoner of war camp, they came across this South African who did fight for Nazi Germany. He studied abroad in Germany, and he didn't want to return home, and so he ended up enlisting in the German army. They noticed him because they heard a German soldier speaking Afrikaans. But again, like I said, that wasn't the vast majority of Afrikaners during World War II. Most of them, I'm sorry, it wasn't the vast majority of them. There was a lot of pro-Allied sentiment among the Afrikaners. If there wasn't, then there was no way J.C. Smuts would have ended up being Prime Minister, as I pointed out in previous videos. And as I pointed out, there were Afrikaner prisoners of war that were tortured at the hands of the Axis powers. So, anyways, it's an excellent book, and I highly recommend this book. It does talk about how when the prisoners of war got home, they weren't typically well received, and they weren't compensated because of a lot of pro-Nazi sentiment within the National Party, which was an unfortunate case. But God bless the POWs. They were heroes. When Karen Horne, the author of the book, interviewed the POWs, she was amazed how humble the POWs were, that they didn't see themselves as heroes. They just saw themselves as doing their job. And they seemed to believe in their cause, believed in fighting for freedom and against fascism. So God bless these POWs. They endured a lot of tortures, and they were still very humble about it. And a lot of them continued on with their lives. So anyways, hope everyone's doing well. Take care. God bless them. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.